The sound drifted through the partially open office door like a whispered prayer, stopping Ethan Moretti dead in his tracks. For 3 years, he had walked these hallways in complete silence, his world reduced to the mechanical rhythm of business calls and board meetings. Nothing had penetrated the fortress of guilt he'd built around his heart. Nothing had made him feel anything. But this voice, soft, pure, filled with a faith he'd lost the night everything went wrong, was different. She was singing a hymn, something about grace and second chances, while dusting his bookshelves. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a woman he'd barely noticed, cleaning his sanctuary while singing about redemption, completely unaware that the most dangerous man in Chicago was standing just outside his own office, frozen by the beauty of her voice. Who was this woman who dared to bring light into his darkness? And why did her song feel like the first real thing he'd experienced since the accident that took everything from him? This story explores the journey of healing and unexpected love. To follow this emotional transformation, join our community as we work toward reaching 5,000 subscribers. Your support makes all the difference. Subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Sarah Chen had been working at the Moretti estate for exactly 3 weeks, 2 days and 4 hours. Not that she was counting the time it took to earn enough money to finally feel secure, or the moments she spent trying to understand the man who lived like a ghost in his own home. The mansion sprawled across Chicago's most exclusive neighborhood, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers, but it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Mrs. Moretti, Ethan's mother, had hired Sarah personally, explaining that her son needed someone who could work independently and wouldn't bother him with unnecessary chatter. The pay was exceptional, more than Sarah had ever imagined earning, and the work wasn't difficult. Mostly she cleaned rooms that seemed untouched, prepared meals that were barely eaten, and maintained a household that felt perpetually empty. The only rule was absolute: never disturb Mr. Moretti's office. But today, as Sarah arranged fresh flowers in the main hallway, she noticed the office door was not just closed, it was slightly ajar, and the room appeared empty. She'd seen Ethan leave for his morning meeting, his usual black suit immaculate, his expression carved from stone. He never returned before afternoon. The office itself was a mystery she'd been dying to solve. Through quick glimpses, she'd seen towering bookshelves, a massive mahogany desk and windows that overlooked the estate's perfectly manicured gardens. But she'd also noticed something else, a thick layer of dust on everything, as if the room was a shrine he couldn't bear to properly maintain, but couldn't abandon either. Making a decision that would change everything, Sarah gathered her cleaning supplies and stepped inside. The office took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the space with natural light, illuminating walls lined with leather-bound books and vintage photographs. But what struck her most was how utterly lifeless it felt. This should have been the heart of the home, but instead, it pulsed with an almost tangible sadness. She began dusting carefully, respectfully, treating each item as if it were precious. When she reached the bookshelf behind the desk, she noticed a small Bluetooth speaker, tucked between volumes of Shakespeare and business journals. Without thinking, she connected her phone and selected a song that had been bringing her comfort lately, a contemporary Christian hymn about healing and hope. As the gentle melody filled the room, Sarah found herself humming along, then singing softly while she worked. The words spoke of grace undeserved, of beauty rising from ashes, of love that could heal the deepest wounds. She had no idea that her voice was carrying through the partially open door and down the hallway where Ethan Moretti had just returned from his meeting. He stood frozen in the corridor, his hand raised to push open the office door, as the most beautiful sound he'd heard in 3 years washed over him. The voice was untrained but pure, filled with an emotion that cut straight through his carefully constructed defenses. For a moment, he was transported back to Sunday mornings with Isabella, who used to sing while making breakfast, her voice bright with joy and unwavering faith. But this wasn't Isabella, this was something else entirely, a sign, perhaps, that he wasn't as dead inside as he'd believed. Instead of entering his office, Ethan backed away silently and left for work, the melody echoing in his mind for the rest of the day. The next morning brought Chicago's first snow of the season, coating the estate's grounds in pristine white that reminded Ethan too much of wedding dresses and innocence lost. He came down to breakfast earlier than usual, drawn by an impulse he couldn't name and didn't trust. Sarah was setting his place at the dining room table, her movements efficient and graceful. She wore a simple navy dress and white apron, her long black hair pulled back in a neat bun. She'd been virtually invisible to him for weeks, just another piece of household machinery that kept his world running. But now, watching her careful attention to detail, the way she adjusted his coffee cup twice to get it perfectly aligned, the small spray of baby's breath she'd added to the flower arrangement, he realized she'd been bringing small touches of life to his sterile world all along. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, his voice rougher than intended after years of avoiding casual conversation. She startled, nearly dropping the crystal water glass in her hand. In 3 weeks, their entire relationship had consisted of polite nods and murmured, "Yes, sir," responses. She kept her eyes lowered as she replied, "Good morning, Mr. Moretti." Ethan took his usual seat, but instead of immediately burying himself in financial reports, he found himself studying her face. She had delicate features and expressive brown eyes that she seemed determined to hide. There was something about her that suggested quiet strength, a resilience that intrigued him. "Sarah," he said as she moved toward the kitchen, stopping her mid-step. "The hymn you were playing yesterday in my office, what was it called?" The color drained from her face. I'm so sorry, Mr. Moretti. I didn't realize you were home. I know I'm not supposed to go in there. I was just trying to—" "It's fine," he interrupted, surprised by how much her obvious distress affected him. "I'm not angry. I thought it was beautiful. The song, I mean, and your voice." Sarah's cheeks flushed pink, and she twisted her hands together. "It's called Beauty for Ashes. I didn't mean to disturb anything. I was just trying to clean, and sometimes music helps me work, but I should have asked first." "Beauty for Ashes," he repeated, the title hitting him like a physical blow. How perfectly, cruelly appropriate. "You have a lovely voice." "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. "Do you sing often?" She glanced up at him briefly, surprise flickering across her features. "I used to sing in church back home in California, but I haven't, not for a while." "Why not?" The question hung between them, more personal than any conversation they'd shared. Sarah hesitated, clearly struggling with whether to answer honestly to her enigmatic employer. "Sometimes when life gets complicated, it's hard to find reasons to sing," she said finally. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding more than she could possibly know. "Yes, I imagine it is." Something shifted in that moment, some invisible wall cracking just enough to let in a sliver of light. Sarah noticed it too, the way his shoulders relaxed slightly, the almost imperceptible softening around his eyes. "I should let you have your breakfast," she said, moving toward the kitchen again. "Sarah," he called once more, making her pause at the doorway. Would you consider playing music while you work? I find it pleasant." A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "Of course, Mr. Moretti." As she disappeared into the kitchen, Ethan realized something extraordinary had just happened. For the first time in 3 years, he'd had a conversation about something other than business, and for just a moment, the crushing weight on his chest had felt lighter. But what he didn't know was that Sarah had recognized something in his eyes when she mentioned losing reasons to sing, a pain that matched her own, a brokenness that called to the healer in her heart. 2 weeks later, Ethan found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, leaving work early to get home before Sarah finished her shift. Their morning conversations had become the highlight of his day. Nothing deep, nothing that threatened the walls he'd built, but small exchanges that felt like water to a man dying of thirst. She'd ask about his business, and he'd find himself explaining deals and strategies to someone who listened with genuine interest. She'd mention books she was reading, and he'd discover she had a mind for literature that rivaled his expensive education. And always, somewhere in the background, there was music. Sarah had taken his request to heart, filling the mansion with everything from classical hymns to contemporary Christian music. The house that had been silent as a tomb for 3 years now hummed with life. But it was the evening ritual that had completely undone him. He'd discovered it by accident. Staying late in his home office, he'd heard the soft sound of piano music coming from the main living room. Investigating, he'd found Sarah at the baby grand piano that hadn't been touched since Isabella's death, playing a complex piece from memory while singing, in a voice that seemed to channel everything beautiful he'd lost. She'd stopped immediately when she saw him, face flaming with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't know you were home. Mrs. Moretti mentioned that no one played anymore, and I just, don't stop, he'd said, the words coming from somewhere deep and desperate. Please. That had been a week ago. Now every evening at 7, Ethan would pour himself a whiskey and settle into the leather chair that gave him the perfect view of the piano. Sarah would play for exactly 30 minutes, hymns, classical pieces, sometimes contemporary songs she'd learned years ago. She never looked at him directly, but he could feel her awareness of his presence in the way she chose her music, always something healing, always something that spoke to grief and hope and redemption. Tonight was different. When he arrived home, he found Sarah in the library instead of the living room, curled up in the window seat with a chessboard balanced on her knees, playing both sides of a game. "You play chess," he observed, setting down his briefcase. Sarah looked up, startled. "Oh, yes, sir. My father taught me when I was little. I hope you don't mind. I found the set in the cabinet and thought, would you like a real opponent?" The question surprised them both. Ethan hadn't played chess since college, but something about the way she studied the board, the careful way she considered each move, made him want to test that quick mind of hers. "I should warn you," Sarah said, a spark of mischief lighting her eyes for the first time since he'd known her. "I'm not easy to beat." "Neither am I." They reset the board, Sarah taking white. Within 10 moves, Ethan realized she hadn't been exaggerating. Her strategy was unconventional but brilliant. Each piece moved with purpose that wasn't immediately apparent but devastatingly effective as the game progressed. "Where did you learn to play like this?" he asked, after she captured his queen with a move he never saw coming. "My father was a mathematics professor before he died. He said chess was the perfect combination of art and science." Her voice caught slightly on the mention of her father, and Ethan recognized the tone of old grief. Well managed, but never forgotten. "How long ago?" 4 years. Cancer." She moved her rook, placing his king in check. "Your move, Mr. Moretti." They played in comfortable silence after that, the only sounds the soft click of pieces on the board and the distant hum of Chicago traffic. Ethan found himself watching her face as much as the board, fascinated by the way she considered each move, the small smile that played across her lips when she saw 3 moves ahead of him. She won, of course, decisively. "Rematch?" she asked, and he realized she was enjoying herself as much as he was. "Tomorrow," he promised, then stopped, struck by the implications of that simple word. Tomorrow meant he was planning to come home early again. Tomorrow meant he was actively seeking out her company. Tomorrow meant he was starting to heal, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. But as Sarah smiled, really smiled, bright and genuine and transformative, Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in 3 years, tomorrow didn't feel like another day to survive. It felt like something to anticipate. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in November, during what had become their 4th week of chess matches. Sarah had won again, she usually did, but instead of immediately resetting the board, she sat back and studied Ethan with an expression he'd never seen before. Direct, almost challenging. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Moretti?" He nodded, curious about what could have put that determined set to her shoulders. "Why don't you smile?" The question hit him like a physical blow. In all their conversations, all their careful dancing around personal topics, she'd never been this direct. "What do you mean?" "I've been working here for almost 2 months. I've seen you focused, I've seen you frustrated, I've seen you thinking, but I've never seen you smile. Not once." She leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. "I've also seen the photos." Ethan's blood chilled. "What photos?" "The ones in your office. The beautiful woman and the little girl. They look like you." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper now. "Where are they?" For a moment, the walls he'd built so carefully around his heart threatened to crumble entirely. No one had asked him about Isabella and Elena directly. Everyone who mattered already knew, and everyone else had learned not to ask. But Sarah was looking at him with such genuine concern, such careful compassion, that he found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "They're dead." The words fell into the room like stones into deep water. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't offer empty condolences, didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless comfort. She just waited, and somehow that patience gave him permission to continue. "My wife, Isabella. My daughter, Elena. 3 years ago." His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rusty from disuse. "Car accident." "I'm sorry," Sarah said simply, and the sincerity in those 2 words meant more than all the elaborate sympathy he'd received from business associates and family friends. "I was driving," he continued, though he hadn't planned to. "We'd been arguing about something stupid. I can't even remember what now. I was angry, distracted. I took the turn too fast, hit black ice." He closed his eyes, seeing it all again with perfect clarity. "They died on impact. I walked away with scratches." When he opened his eyes, Sarah was watching him with tears streaming silently down her face. Not pity, he would have fled from pity, but genuine grief for people she'd never met. Pain shared simply because his pain was real. "That's why you don't smile," she said softly. "You don't think you deserve to." The accuracy of her observation left him breathless. "Do I?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful attention she brought to chess moves. When she spoke, her words were measured but firm. "My father used to say that grief is love with nowhere to go. The love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It just gets trapped inside us, and if we're not careful, it turns into poison." She reached across the chessboard, and for the first time since he'd known her, touched his hand. "But love was meant to create life, not destroy it. Your wife and daughter, did they love you?" "Yes." The word came out broken. "Would they want their love to destroy you?" Ethan stared down at her small hand covering his, feeling something crack open inside his chest. Not breaking, but finally allowing light to seep through. "Isabella used to sing," he said suddenly. "Just like you. She'd sing while she cooked, while she cleaned, while she played with Elena. The house was always full of music." "Tell me about them," Sarah said. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan did. He told her about Isabella's laugh, about Eleanor's obsession with butterflies, about Sunday morning pancakes and bedtime stories, and all the small, perfect moments that had made up his life before everything went wrong. Sarah listened to every word, crying quietly for the family she'd never met, and somehow in the sharing, the memories stopped feeling like weapons and started feeling like gifts again. When he finished, they sat in silence as snow began to fall outside the library windows. Finally, Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "Thank you for telling me about them. They sound like they were wonderful." They were. Ethan looked at their joined hands, marveling at how such a simple touch could feel so significant. "Sarah?" "Yes. Would you play something for them tonight? Something Isabella might have liked?" Sarah's smile was radiant. "I'd be honored." As they moved to the piano, Ethan realized that for the first time since the accident, talking about his family hadn't felt like reopening a wound. Instead, it felt like the first step toward healing, and he had this remarkable woman to thank for that. Spring arrived early in Chicago that year, and with it came a decision that would change everything. Ethan had been planning it for weeks, ever since the evening Sarah had helped him remember that his love for Isabella and Elena was meant to honor them, not destroy him. Their relationship had evolved beyond employer and employee into something deeper, friendship certainly, but also something more fragile and precious that neither of them had dared to name. The chess games continued, along with their evening concerts and increasingly personal conversations. Ethan had begun to smile, tentatively at first, then more frequently as Sarah's gentle humor and infinite patience gradually coaxed him back to life. She'd never pushed, never demanded more than he was ready to give, but she'd been there for every small step forward, celebrating each victory and gently encouraging him through the setbacks. Now, as he watched her arranging fresh flowers in the front hall, humming a tune that had become their signature song, Ethan knew it was time. "Sarah," he called, emerging from his office with a manila folder in his hand. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" She followed him into the library, their informal headquarters for important conversations. But instead of settling into their usual chess table, Ethan remained standing, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since his first corporate presentation. "I have a proposition for you," he began, then stopped, struck by how inadequate the word proposition was for what he was about to offer. Sarah waited with that infinite patience that had become so precious to him. "I've been thinking about my company, Moretti Enterprises. I've been running it essentially alone since the accident. But lately I've realized that isolation isn't strength. It's just another form of hiding." He handed her the folder. "I'd like to offer you a position as my personal assistant." Sarah's eyes widened as she opened the folder and saw the salary figure. It was more than generous. It was life-changing. "Mr. Moretti, "This is incredible, but I'm not qualified for this kind of position. I don't have business experience or—" "You have something better," Ethan interrupted. "You understand people. You listen. You see solutions where others see problems. And—" he paused, struggling to articulate something he'd never admitted to himself. "You make me want to be better than I was." The admission hung between them, weighted with everything they'd shared over the past months. "The position would mean working closely with me," he continued. "Travel to meetings, late nights, high-pressure situations. It wouldn't be easy, but I think we make a good team." Sarah closed the folder carefully, her expression thoughtful. "Can I ask why you're offering this to me?" It was a fair question, and one Ethan had been asking himself for weeks. The honest answer was complex. Part practical recognition of her abilities, part selfish desire to keep her in his life, and part something deeper that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. "Because in 4 months you've reminded me what it feels like to be human," he said simply. "Because you've brought music back into my life. Because you've shown me that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and that it's possible to honor the past while building something new." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'd love to work with you." The transition was seamless, as if Sarah had been meant for the corporate world all along. She had an intuitive understanding of business relationships and an uncanny ability to anticipate Ethan's needs before he knew them himself. More than that, she brought the same gentle strength to his professional life that she'd brought to his personal healing. Watching her navigate board meetings with grace, organize complex travel schedules with effortless efficiency, and handle demanding clients with diplomatic skill, Ethan realized he'd been wrong about what he was offering her. He hadn't just given Sarah a job, he'd found himself a true partner. And somewhere between the late-night strategy sessions and the shared victories, between the comfortable silences and the easy laughter, Ethan realized that what he felt for Sarah had evolved far beyond gratitude or friendship. He was falling in love again, and for the first time since Isabella's death, that didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like a gift. 6 months later, Ethan stood on the balcony of his downtown office, watching Sarah through the glass doors as she finished a phone call with their biggest client. The Chicago skyline stretched endlessly before him, but his attention was entirely focused on the woman who had transformed not just his business, but his entire world. She'd insisted on redecorating his office, bringing in plants and softer lighting, family photos that no longer brought pain, but comfort. The sterile corporate environment had been replaced with something that felt alive, purposeful. Their success had been extraordinary. Sarah's insights and people skills had helped land 3 major contracts, and their partnership had become the foundation for the company's most profitable quarter in years. But it was the personal transformation that took his breath away. Sarah had cut her hair shorter, the style more confident and professional, though she still wore the small silver cross necklace that had been her father's. She'd grown into her role with remarkable grace, but she'd never lost the gentle spirit that had first drawn him to her. She still played piano every evening, still sang while she worked, still beat him at chess with embarrassing regularity. The difference was in her eyes, where once there had been careful reserve, now there was warmth and mischief and something deeper that made his heart race every time she looked at him. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, after months of careful friendship and professional partnership, Ethan was finally ready to tell Sarah how he felt. The phone call ended, and Sarah joined him on the balcony, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the soft smile that had become his favorite sight in the world. "Successful call?" he asked, accepting his coffee. "Very. Morrison wants to expand the contract for next year." She leaned against the balcony railing beside him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something light and floral that reminded him of hope. "I think we might need to hire additional staff soon." "We?" The word had slipped out naturally, but its implications weren't lost on either of them. They'd become a true partnership in business and increasingly in everything else. "Is that presumptuous?" Sarah asked, a hint of uncertainty creeping into her voice. "No," Ethan said quietly. "It's exactly right." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over Lake Michigan. The view was spectacular, but Ethan found himself watching Sarah instead, memorizing the way the golden light played across her features. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of everything he'd been holding back. "There's something I need to tell you." She turned to face him fully, and he saw his own nervous anticipation reflected in her eyes. I know I hired you to be my assistant, and you've been extraordinary at that. But somewhere along the way you became something much more important." He reached for her hand, marveling at how right it felt. "You saved my life, Sarah. You brought me back from a place I didn't think I could return from." "Ethan," she began, but he gently interrupted. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "Actually, I think I've been falling in love with you since the first time I heard you sing. I know it's complicated. We work together and I'm your boss, and I know I come with more baggage than anyone should have to carry, but I had to tell you because hiding it was becoming impossible." Sarah's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. "You're not the only one with baggage," she said softly, "and you're not the only one who's been falling." The kiss was gentle, tentative at first, then deeper as months of carefully controlled attraction finally found expression. When they broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now," Ethan said, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "we take it one day at a time. We build something beautiful together. And maybe—" He paused, struck by a vision that had been growing stronger each day. "Maybe eventually we build the family I never thought I'd want again." Sarah's eyes filled with happy tears. "You want to be a father again? With you? More than anything." He pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. "But only when you're ready. Only when we're ready. We have time." "I'd like that," she whispered against his chest. "I'd like that very much." As they stood together on the balcony, watching stars begin to appear over Chicago, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 3 years ago, he'd thought his story was over, that grief had rendered him incapable of love or joy or hope. But Sarah had shown him that endings could become beginnings, that love lost didn't preclude love found, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from hearts that have learned to sing again after breaking. Tomorrow, they would continue building their business empire, planning their future, creating the life neither of them had dared to dream was possible. But tonight, they would simply hold each other and listen to the music of their healing hearts, knowing that the best chapters of their story were still being written. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan Moretti smiled. Really, truly smiled, and meant it completely. This story of healing and second chances has reached its conclusion. If it touched your heart in any way, please leave your like and share it with someone who also loves emotional stories. New stories arrive soon. Until next time.